Come on. Hello, everyone. It's Jamal Thomas. Welcome to the Progressive Soapbox. So, guys, I have the man himself, Nick Brana. He's here on the Soapbox. He is going to be discussing the People's Party, in addition to a bunch of other stuff, talking about politics and everything else. So, please, Nick, please say hi to the Soapbox. I don't have a name for the people who are here. I just call them the participants. But please say hi to the viewers and introduce yourself with the people who don't necessarily know who you are.
Hey, Soapboxers and Jamarl's followers. It's great to be with you. I am Nick Brana, founder of Draft Burning for a People's Party, which is now, which you may have known, and is now Movement for a People's Party. And so we are building the coalition for a major new progressive party in the United States. And that entails bringing together existing progressive parties, unions, academics, or students, campus groups, communities of color, all kinds of progressive organizations, so that we are no longer dividing our efforts. And very much like the establishment does, you know, they collaborate against us. We got to collaborate against them. You know, otherwise we got no hope of overcoming, you know, all of the institutional advantages they have. So that's our mission. And you can find us at forapeoplesparty.org.
Let me ask you this. How did you get involved in all this? Like, I know you were working with Sanders. You were his communications director, I think. How did you get involved in this political scene just from ground up? I mean, just in the beginning itself.
Yeah. So I was his national political outreach coordinator.
Ah, I see.
And that was on the Bernie campaign. And then I went on and so that entailed like a lot of work with the super-delegates, lobbying them for Bernie, you know, helping to organize his political meetings and convention work at the end. And then after that, I went on to join Our Revolution, and I was its electoral manager as a founding member of Our Revolution. So and then that brought me to Draft Bernie and to Movement for a People's Party. So. But I mean, before that, I got involved in progressive politics. I got involved in politics in general. I studied sociology at the College of William and Mary, and that kind of gave me an interest in, you know, I would say what it did is it taught me that the way that society is organized is a social construct, you know, and that it's not kind of like a consequence of natural laws or anything like that. It's not a law of physics. Rather, it's, oh, can you hear me?
Slightly breaking up on me. It's doing a little something weird.
Oh,
I can hear you. The last part I heard was it's not natural law. You sound like you're making my argument of it's not God. Like God didn't do it. God didn't organize our society.
Yeah. So I guess if you watch Jamarl's show, you're very well acquainted with this. So that's what studying sociology taught me. Is I learned that society is as it exists right now is not a consequence of like, you know, some law of physics. It's not a divine action. It is the result of direct choices that we have made politically and a certain incentive structure that we've created, you know. And so then that kind of led me to working initially on establishment campaigns. Like I worked on Terry McAuliffe's campaign for governor in Virginia. Yeah. Okay. Oh, it was a journey for me. I had my story arc. And so and I went all the way from that, you know, and of course, for anyone who knows Terry McAuliffe, he was the biggest fundraiser for Bill Clinton.
Yeah, governor. I mean, well, he used to be governor. Northam is taking his place. But
exactly, yeah. He's on his way out now. But I mean, I also worked for John Kerry, and after doing that kind of, you know, after working for some establishment politicians, I said the things that I saw there taught me that was not the solution. The Democratic Party, and establishment Democratic Party politics was not the solution. And that led me to Bernie in 2015. I was super excited to join his campaign. And then that brought me all the way here.
That's interesting. Yeah, man, that's interesting. Wow, that's a hell of an arc. That is a hell of an arc. I mean, yeah, man, that's a hell of an art. I'm curious. You said something about lobbying the super-delegates for Bernie Sanders and working on the last him in the conference itself. So by the conference, you mean the point where Sanders was out there crying and saying, "I'm supporting Hillary." Like that main DNC conference is the one that you're talking about, where the people were crying and that type of stuff. Let me ask you, the super-delegates themselves. I'm curious. and I'll go into something else. I don't want to dwell on the super delegates. I'm just curious about this part. In lobbying the super delegates, what was being said? Most of those super delegates had already given their vote to Hillary Clinton. So when you were making that lobby, were you also lobbying people who had already given their vote, or were you only lobbying people who were undecided?
Well, we knew that a lot of the superdelegates were going to be against us and that Bernie wasn't going to win with establishment support. And like you pointed out, there were 714 of them, and 400 of them had pledged for Hillary right before Bernie even like joined the race, you know. And so that meant that before a single vote was cast, months before a single vote was cast, Hillary was already about 15% of the way to the nomination. You know,
Wow.
which shows, and exactly, it shows you how corrupt the Democratic Party is. Not even the Republican Party has superdelegates, for Christ's sake, you know, and they did away with them. The Democratic Party still has some, you know, and so,
You know,
yeah, I mean, it basically consisted of talking to them, trying to get them to, you know, to see that this is what people want, you know, and you should stand up for what people want. But at that time, you know, that philosophy was obviously one of appealing to the Democratic Party kind of on moral grounds. And, you know, I think as many of us in the progressive community now understand, that doesn't get you anywhere.
that doesn't
They
matter.
have financial interests, right? It's in the direct financial interest to remain, you know, corporate. I mean, a lot of them have been, especially, you know, the politicians and people in Congress, they've been working for, who are a lot of the superdelegates. They have been working for the establishment and for Wall Street for years. And so, you know, what they've been doing is kind of like accumulating a severance package, so to speak. So when they retire, they're going to go take a job on Wall Street or K Street, and they're going to, you know, get $500,000 for being a consultant or giving speeches or whatever, you know. And so like these people have like, you know, that's their nest egg, so to speak. And so they're not going to throw that away. You know, and on top of that, they're just friends with those people. I mean, that's their social circle. So they're not going to
It's a
throw that
workable
away
point of view. Yeah.
because you make a moral argument to them, you know.
Yeah.
Most of the argument,
Integrity doesn't count. Morality doesn't count. None of that stuff doesn't count. I've often said it's one thing if we have a difference and you and I are debating something. It's another thing when that difference, where you're fixed in a position because you're either paid or you have some other interest that's pushing you in that position. I mean, hell, besides the moral argument, even the argument of, look, when you're looking at the polls, she's losing to somebody like Ted Cruz.
right?
It's like if your job, like the argument that they used to make about superdelegates was, look, we keep them here because they're the release valve. If anything is going to go wrong with where the public is picking a candidate that's going to lose, that's going to get tanked, that's going to get obliterated, and it is very clear that the person is going to lose and get obliterated. The superdelegates are here to be the stop valve, to say, all right, we're going to put our hands down on this particular candidate because the other guy is going to lose. And you're looking at the polls and you're like, well, what the hell are you guys using to make this decision on who's going to win or lose if you're not using a polls? And you can clearly see one person is getting trashed by the opposition, meaning as gross and as over-the-top horrible as Ted Cruz is, she was losing to Ted Cruz in the polls. Like Kasich, she was losing to Kasich, or she might have been like maybe 1 or 2 points away. Sanders was trashing all of these guys. And the superdelegates will still look at you in the face and say, well, look, we're giving this vote to Hillary Clinton. Joe Manchin has this famous, what's that famous? I thought it was famous because I thought it was telling. Where he says, well, I had already promised my vote to so-and-so. Like, what do you mean you had promised your vote to so-and-so? It hadn't even started. Yeah, man, the superdelegates thing. And then one of the women was making an argument about why superdelegates needed to be there. And it was essentially the public doesn't know what the public wants. We're friends with these people. We would know because we're the Democratic Party's decision on this when we put our votes in a particular person. I mean, this is an amazing argument. Public doesn't know what they want. Public shouldn't be making this choice. I mean, this is the Democratic Party making an argument for why the public shouldn't be able to choose their candidate. And yeah, you're right. The Republican Party doesn't have anything.
They're fundamentally arguing against democracy.
They are.
That's because they don't, like, in some, you know, they fundamentally don't believe in it. I mean, you know, that's what it comes down to, is they think that we are unqualified as the public to make decisions about, you know, who should be the candidate and who we should have as president or to manage the country. And so the country has to be managed by a small number of, you know, elites.
elites, the governing class, the
Wall
governing
Street
class.
funders.
Yeah.
So exactly. And so, that's the general attitude. And yeah, the greatest irony is that the superdelegates were created to prevent supposedly unelectable candidates. But in this case,
They tried when they put one in.
but people are so sick of establishment politics. The unelectable candidate was the establishment. It was Hillary Clinton.
Yeah.
And so,
Lost to Donald Trump.
right. And so they kind of reversed their mandate, to pick the unelectable candidate. And I mean, I told them till I was blue in the face, that it's like, look, here's the figures, just like, poll after poll after poll that shows that Hillary Clinton is at a great risk of losing. And I mean, they didn't care because ultimately they consciously chose. It's not that they were unaware. They consciously chose to go with the less electable candidate, And you would think that if they believed half of the rhetoric, that came out of their mouth during the campaign, and that still does against Trump, then they would have thought, well, Trump is like, Armageddon and the Antichrist, and therefore we should probably do what gives us the best chance of beating him.
See, but that's
which
the catch.
would have been
It's
Bernie.
us. What you just said right there, us, will give us the best chance of beating them. What I often say when people are like giving these speeches and everything else, you have to really pay attention to who they're talking to, their audience. Like the audience is not the entirety of the United States. The audience is very specific, select people who they themselves align with. Democrats would prefer, they don't consider Bernie Sanders and us, if that makes sense. Like the people who are the people who are saying the Hillbots and all these other people who are the elites of the party, they don't consider Bernie Sanders and us. In fact, they consider him a problem. Like you can have this game where you've rigged the system, where you can say the less evil or the least worse. In which case you have your least worst candidate. You can always run that gimmick and run that scam, providing there's not somebody there who's actually not least worst, who's just better, who's just fundamentally better, who actually believes it, who's a true believer. Meaning the Democrats can't call themselves the actual left or the definitive left in the country if there's somebody else standing to their left. If Bernie Sanders is there and Bernie Sanders changes fundamentally what it means to be a Democrat, so New Deal Democrats, meaning the FDR types, representative of Sanders, going against these third-way Democrats, represented by Obama, Clinton, Gore, these Hillbot types. They fundamentally don't want a Sanders type to win that because it fundamentally changes what it means to be a Democrat in this country. Their workable point of view gets demolished. They can't tolerate that. It is easier and better for them to lose to Donald Trump and maintain this idea of this kind of hegemonic view of what it means to be on the left in the United States than it is to allow Sanders to win, Sanders to choose who's the head of the DNC, and Sanders to put forth this kind of plan that forces them to make a choice. Like if you don't have, if say for instance Obama got in office and Obama said, we're doing Medicare for all, that forces each Democrat to make a choice on what do they actually represent. None of this milquetoast stuff. What do you actually represent? If you have a real person who actually believes those things and is putting those things up, it forces them to choose. And the fact is, it reveals who they are based on the choices that they do when they're actually presented with a left progressive agenda. That's what I think. I don't think they consider Sanders and us. I think they consider Sanders a problem. And so between putting Hillary Clinton up, meaning they wanted to win, but they wanted to win on their terms. And if they couldn't win on their terms, they were okay with allowing Republicans to take it, believing that they're going to be so gross that in 4 years, they'll get another chance.
Yeah, and that's really important, I think, to understand because people who separate the Democratic Party and treat it like a separate entity from those who fund it, Wall Street, that's an incorrect way to view them, right? The Democratic Party is basically a spokesperson for Wall Street, and for the oligarchs. And so once you realize that, and once you think about that and you kind of absorb the implications of that, it is that, well, the Democratic and the Republican parties are spokespeople for the oligarchs. And guess what? The Democratic and the Republican parties, which are both the oligarchs, they're both just subsidiaries of the oligarchs, they win whether Hillary wins or Trump wins. They win either way, And so the only way that they lose is if you get a progressive or somebody who's against, the establishment from a left perspective, challenging them. And so to them, from their perspective, as they own both of these subsidiaries, the Democrat and the Republican Party, they would rather have the Democratic Party, one of their subsidiaries, lose just to have the other win in order to hold back a progressive. And so I think that's the way to look at it. And once you kind of internalize that, you realize why the superdelegates consciously chose to go with the less electable candidate, and why they chose to lose as opposed to going with someone like Bernie who could have won. And so once you know that, you see that there really is no working with the Democratic Party, because it's a party that would literally rather cease to exist than to represent working people.
That's so sad. That's so sad. I mean, FDR is rolling in his grave, because and the sad part is they still use the same rhetoric of the FDR era. Like, there's no shame about it at all. Like, there's a level of hypocrisy in this that's obscene. We must protect the whistleblowers. We must protect the whistleblowers. While Obama was throwing one whistleblower after the next in prison, but the moment Trump gets in office, we must protect the whistleblowers. Or how much they hated George Bush. Oh, we hate George Bush. George Bush is invading these countries and killing all of these people. And Obama gets in office, still doing drones, expands it to 7 other countries. Nothing. Crickets. Get shut up about it. Like, I guess my point is, you're right. Ultimately, they would give lip service to certain things, to certain lefty causes, because they need those people to vote for them. And they will say, look, we're going to do this particular agenda, but their agenda is only in comparison to Republicans. Republicans are off the spectrum. So the agenda that you get is still to the right. And ultimately, this is a conversation between oligarchs. I mean, one is more rapacious than the other, but both are rapacious. So the best that they could do for healthcare is a right-wing healthcare plan. Think about that. You get in office, you're supposed to be the Democratic Party, and the best that you could do is choose a right-wing healthcare plan. I guess I'm making this point that if you're not able to affect a particular agenda on the left with the party that's supposed to be on the left, then what's the point? Particularly when you're still getting right-wing policies. I mean, like, the point of politics is not just politics. The point of politics is to get things done. There are problems in your society that needs to be addressed and needs to be solved. And if they can't be solved in the 2 vehicles that you have, then you need another vehicle. You need another vehicle. I think this brings us to the People's Party thing. So explain to us what the People's Party is, the movement for People's Party.
Yeah. So like I mentioned earlier, the establishment collaborates against progressives all the time. They have ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, where corporations literally get together, write legislation, and hand it to politicians. They have the Chamber of Commerce. They have the Democrat and Republican parties. And so all of these are vehicles through which corporations come together and oligarchs come together, and they collaborate against us.
And Nick, just so people are clear, both of those parties are fundamentally one thing. Like, it's not, I know people are normalizing and believing that they have a choice, left or right, Democrat or Republican, as if these are 2 extremes. It's perspective at this point. It's like, because you believe that there are only 2 parties, whatever position these 2 parties take for the most part comes across as being extremes. But they're not extremes. They're so closely related to one another that it's hard to create that distinction between those 2 things. We are thinking about politics in this way. You almost have to think of that party or those 2 parties as being one thing with 2 wings, one being more rapacious than the other wing, but ultimately the same thing. Yeah. Sorry, Nick, I didn't want to interrupt. I just wanted to make it very clear to people that when we're talking about aligning against progressives, we're talking about both. We're not talking about one. We're talking about both parties.
That's right. That's right. That's why Chomsky said it's not accurate to think of them as 2 different entities. That's right. And that's why Chomsky says that the U.S. is a one-party state.
It is.
And that it has 2 right wings, the Democrats and Republicans, and they just trade power. And see, when you start to see it that way, you start to understand that they serve different roles. And so the role of the Republican Party, is to kind of drag us, to new depths, to new corporate depths, to new corporate extremes and military extremes, and in the way that Trump is doing right now. But then the Democratic Party's role, and this is just as vital as the Republican Party's, to the corporations and to the establishment. The Democratic Party's role is that in this trading of power that they do is to normalize then what the Republican Party did. And so, you know, you bring the conversation to a new plateau, a new low, you know, that it hasn't been before. And you see this pattern repeated over and over and over. Like when George Bush Sr. handed over to Clinton, Bill Clinton, for example, Clinton picked up right on NAFTA where Bush Sr. left off. You know, picked right up. He basically normalized all of the tax reductions that Reagan had done. You know, and okay, you move forward now. You see Bush Bush Jr. and his presidency, all of the wars he had. You know, the bailouts, the too big to jail, the tax cuts again. You know, and all kinds of all of those things. You know, the mass surveillance. Obama came in, he normalized, rather than challenging it, now he ran a campaign on challenging it. They always do. They always run a campaign on challenging it. But rather than doing that, he came in, he normalized it, expanded the wars, even picked up Bush's Secretary of Defense, you know, and ended up putting in more troops into having a troop surge that was larger than what Bush Jr. had wanted into Afghanistan, you know. So that's the role that they play. And you need to see them as teammates, basically, you know, because neither of them could do that alone. So, for example, if the Democratic Party was a real left party, what it would be doing is it would be, instead of saying, I'm now going to acquiesce to this new low that you've brought us to, it would be saying, no, I'm going to take us back and further, like working people are calling for.
They would be doing what Trump is doing, the opposite. I mean, the way Trump is coming in is, you know, I'm going to redo or undo all of the tepid changes that Obama put in. Democrats don't do that. Like, they get in office and they would say, I'm going to instantiate 80% of the tax cuts that George Bush put in, even though at the time people said these are horrible, horrible, disgusting tax cuts. And it's like, well, why are you putting these in the law if you think these things are this awful? Meaning, if you guys were complaining about it that much, why are you trying to get into law? It's easy. They don't do that. I mean, they don't roll back the changes or the ghastliness that Republicans do. The next Democratic president that would have came in would have likely instantiated whatever Trump did in this office. They wouldn't roll back the tax cuts. They probably wouldn't roll back the military thing. They may take the drone program out of the CIA and put it back into the military, but it doesn't really matter. Ultimately, it's always status quo. It's not a rollback, or it's not moving forward. It's status quo.
Yeah,
it's problematic. Justin B. Thanks, Justin. Nick, how do you propose the People's Party will work with the Green for All Progressives to be successful in 2018? Will you have a People Party candidate on the ballot in 2018?
Yeah, so 2020 is the main goal, you know, because building a party is a long process. And kind of what's unique about what we're trying to do is that we are aiming to get all of these different groups together to do it, and all of these different parties, you know, and we're talking to many of them, like the Green Party, working with them, the Justice Party. And so, you know, the objective is so that we're not competing, but we're collaborating rather, you know, because we don't, what's holding progressives back right now and what's holding the left back in general. So, I mean, to frame this entire conversation, you have now a record number of people who are calling for a major new party. And so it's almost 2 out of 3 Americans who are calling for a major new party. It's never been that high before. You also have, for the past 15 years, confidence in institutions has declined at historic lows now. The past 15 years, affiliation in the Democratic Republican parties has declined, also at historic lows now. You know, and at the same time, you've seen that record increase in the number of people calling for a major third party, and that record increase in the number of independents in the country. It's now 46% of the country's independents. Only 27% are Democrats and 25% are Republicans. And so now you're at the point where basically you can produce this kind of breaking point. You know, I mean, you are at a point where a major political realignment is possible. But in order to do that, you know, to get to the question, is that you cannot have this kind of diffuse, progressive environment where everybody is siloed and nobody's communicating and nobody's talking to each other. You know, no single, at the Convergence Conference, which you were at this past September, there were 3 points of kind of consensus that kind of emerged there. The first is that we need a major new party. We need a progressive party, an independent alternative to Democrats and Republicans. The second is that it has to be free of corporate money and influence in order to be able to represent the people and not corporations. And the third is that no single organization could do it on its own. And so we have to collaborate to do that. We have to collaborate against the establishment like they collaborate against us all the time. And so that's basically, what we're aiming to do is we're aiming to do it as a coalition, in a coalition fashion. And by bringing all of those groups that I mentioned earlier together. And that is exactly how it was done, actually, in the 1850s, when the Republican Party replaced the Whig Party back then successfully, is they had a coalition of many different groups, abolitionist parties, and many different kind of, stakeholders, former Whigs, who all came together, formed a coalition, launched a Republican Party, and within a few years, they had replaced the Whig Party, and that is kind of the trajectory that we're on now.
Is it fair? I would say the cynics always say that it is impossible to put a third party in place. I mean, that's always the way. It's like Democrats always. I always laugh when I hear somebody in the Democratic Party saying, "Oh, that's impossible. You should just join us." Now, for the cynics, how can I say this? Because I agree with you on this. I think it's always this crazy prospect where they say, well, you're supposed to put them in office and pressure them. And it's like, but you understand, if I'm pressuring them, that's not their natural place. Their natural place is somewhere else. Like, if I have to push you to get you to do the right thing, then you're not in a position to do the right thing. You're being pushed by something else. So I think it's vitally important not to accept corporate cash. So I agree with you on this. I think one more thing is vitally important: to not compete against corporate cash, meaning when you take power, to be able to say, okay, we're done with this corporate cashing. We're done with allowing corporations and put that money into the process, meaning publicly funded elections. Mm-hmm. If you're going to have a party, and if that party is saying, we don't want corporate cash, meaning the election and we need to run in a way that doesn't have corporate cash, then you don't want to run against the corporate cash. Like, you don't want to allow that weapon to stay in place. That weapon needs to be taken off the table. If America is going to get its democracy back, or representative government back, or whatever it is, or at the very least before the people, it has to have publicly funded elections. None of this stuff where plutocrats can influence the political process.
And the Democrats and Republicans will never make that change. I mean, that's what entrenches their power, and it's the money in politics is obviously a very big part of it. And there's many different mechanisms through which, the establishment, corporations, billionaires influence our parties and our politicians. I mean, it's super PAC donations, setting up super PACs as kind of like, shadow campaigns, basically. Yeah. It's dark money. It's revolving door jobs that I mentioned earlier too. And it's lobbyist cash as well that they give, and lobbyist gifts. And so what we have to do is we have to shut off all those mechanisms of influence. And we need to take power. And once we do, then we can shut it off for all parties together,
Now, here's another question that
sorry. Over without, before that, a party needs to take over without those things that, that says, no, we're not gonna do this out of principle,
Right there. That's the question. So being cynical for the moment, Justin, I'll ask this question in a moment, but I'm leading up to it, and you're asking some of the questions I already have. He's like, yeah, this question. Being cynical for the moment, how do you do that? So let's say you have a political process. That political process is ensconced in cash, meaning the person who has the majority of the money in the political process itself tends to win those races. Now, that's not something that might have needed to be there. Democrats often used to lose from the standpoint of cash. They used to win more so by manpower. How do we, as a people's party, meaning a people's party coming together as the third party, how do you run in a contest that's so entrenched and so ensconced with cash in this way?
Yeah, great question. So what I would say to that is, look at what Bernie did. Bernie proved that by running on progressive principles, he raised $250 million. We did on that campaign. So that's the power of it. What's really remarkable about that too is that, I don't think it's been fully understood how truly impressive Bernie's campaign in 2016 was. And so, for example, when Bernie started off, he didn't have he had like 3% name recognition, so no name recognition basically across the country. He had no money. He was taking no money from corporations and billionaires. The party was totally against him. It had already anointed Hillary Clinton. The media was totally against him. All right, so those are all like the traditional factors which are supposed to determine a winner, in our elections, in which, the establishment will tell you over and over again, if you don't have those, you can't win, in order to try to create this self-fulfilling prophecy. But Bernie proved that it was wrong. Bernie proved that that logic, which is still very deep-seated, I think, in our politics, is actually not correct, because he had none of those things. And yet he managed to get, 46% of the vote in the primary, and would have won had it not, the party still had to cheat in order to prevent him from winning, despite him having all those disadvantages. And so the lesson from that, I think the really important lesson, is that there is a force in our politics now that is more powerful than the money and the media and the name recognition. And that is that revolutionary progressive message, that populist progressive alternative.
Yeah. I think this boils down to power base. Like, there's this book, I can't think of the guy's name, Bruce Dilicente or something like that. And he wrote this awesome book. It's somewhat long, somewhat technical, but it boils down to this idea of politics. And it is a depressing read in regards to how people function in the real world with regards to politics. Like, integrity has nothing to do with it. Everything boils down to, what does a person want and what does a person have at their disposal to get the thing that they want. Integrity, race, whatever, all those things are leveraged purely to get what the person wants, until you come across a true believer who gets a little bit different. In the case that you're mentioning, I suspect to some degree that you're right. To a degree, I do think money matters in the politics, but I think it's amplified into this mythic level, because they don't necessarily want people to run in a particular way. Like, if you want to run in a way that says fuck all to the public, then you need money from somewhere else. If you want to run in a way that's representative of the public itself, meaning the public is your power base, then you're going to represent the interests of the public, because that's your power base. You're not going to get money otherwise. It's like, if the public is giving you a huge amount of cash to do something, you're not doing that thing, then the public is no longer going to give you that huge amount of cash. It's almost like the Sanders was being bought by the public in the same way the corporations are buying other politicians.
Exactly.
Yeah, you have a different model of fundraising that doesn't necessarily depend on corporate interests, meaning you're not leaning in that particular direction. So that's a fair point. Is that more so true for the presidency, or do you believe that model can work also on local and state races?
I think it can work in both. And I mean, and there's a lot of examples, like, for example, Ginger Jensen, she actually won the first ballot in Minneapolis, for Minneapolis City Council. She got 35% of the vote, and would have won, ironically, had it not been ranked choice voting. And so she ran as—
Really?
Yes. So she ran she won the first ballot, and then she lost in the second round. And so yeah, and she raised something like, I don't know, more than $150,000 for that city council seat. And so it shows that it can be done. And there are some other things that I would mention too, and that is that we have, and so in the example that I cited earlier of the Republican Party, Lincoln's Republican Party replacing the Whigs, when the Whig Party, that was because the Whig Party abandoned its base and approved a pro-slavery platform when the Whig Party's base had become very anti-slavery. And what happened in the election of 1852 when they did that is that the Whig Party's base didn't show up. They didn't show up, they didn't vote. And so therefore the Democrats back then, the opposition party, swept the election. So it was a disaster, very much analogous to what happened in 2016. You had a candidate anointed by the elite of the party who doesn't, just totally disconnected from what the base wants. Therefore, the base doesn't show up and the election goes to the other party, And so I think something that's instructive and revealing about that is the fact that back then, the American public was actually much more divided on the question of slavery. Like, there were a lot more people who were defending slavery back then than people who are today defending money in politics and inequality, and a lack of access to healthcare and higher education. you know. And so that issue that was kind of the fulcrum issue and the decisive issue back then there was actually much more division than there is now. Now there's like unanimity basically around the issue that the establishment parties aren't representing, you know, especially when you talk about money in politics. And then another thing too is that today they did all of that. And so they got members of Congress elected within a couple of years, got a very influential foothold in Congress in a couple of years. In 4 years, they had basically replaced the Whig Party, and they had taken a majority in the House of Representatives. In 6 years, they had elected Abraham Lincoln president, and they had taken both houses of Congress. And so they did that without the internet. You know, it's like today, you know, we can get our message across at light speed. I mean, back then it was like, it was as fast as a horse can travel, or you can shout, you know? And so we have all kinds of advantages that they didn't have. And the agreement around the need for the change is greater than it was back then. And so in a lot of ways, you know, I think you do have a stage set that is even greater than it was when the Republicans replaced the Whigs.
Look, I agree with you. I guess people are so socialized into believing there are only two parties. Like it's to some degree a socialization, and to some degree it's this I always call it the esoteric other. You know, I'd vote for this other if I thought other people would do it, in which case you limit your vote to the two because you felt like that a vote is not going to matter. One of Justin B. He says, so how do you proposing we collaborate in 2018? The Green Party has electoral infrastructure of the one in 2018. One that folks don't agree. All right, so people always ask this, and I'm going to fold his question into my own. How are you going to collaborate? So how have you been going about trying to get parties to kind of come together? I always say the left is like herding cats, and each one wants his own specific sandbox, even though they, for the most part, believe the same fucking thing. Like in the People's Summit, I remember there were like 20 or 30 different booths. All of these booths all spread out around. Democratic Socialist of America, you had some kind of lefty group, another lefty group. And they were all intents and purposes believing the exact same thing with minor changes associated with it. And it's like, oh my God, you people need to be working together. Now, you've taken the manner of saying, okay, these people need to work together for all intents and purposes. There are things that we all agree on. Let's focus on the things that we all agree on and work together. How do you propose to get those groups to join hands in this kumbaya moment in the sun? And what have you done so far in order? What groups have you been able to pull together and accrue around the People's Party?
So, right. And so that, right, because now the movement has terrible economies of scale. Now, you know, just to emphasize like that problem is that when you have all these different groups and all these different parties who are all kind of spread out, then you get a lot of intra-movement competition. They're competing with each other. And so, and they, you know, for supporters, for donors, for volunteers, for voters, and so basically a lot of the energy, you know, is going internal rather than towards external outward change. And the same thing with our resources. You know, you could say, I mean, this is just kind of an example, but you could say that half of every dollar raised by these groups goes just towards basically survival and competing against the other groups rather than trying to change the system. And so, you know, this is the fundamental concept of economies of scale in economics, which is where when you work together or when you combine, you know, then you can more efficiently and more of your resources can go towards outward change, and you can have a greater focus, you know, you can be more focused in your message and what you're trying to achieve and all of that. Kind of like the way that the movement was very focused when Bernie was running for president. And so we saw, like, we got a taste of our system changing power when we saw that, you know, basically. And so now what we're doing, you know, is we are setting up basically a committee of different groups and inviting different organizations, you know, into it. And we've got the Green Party, we've got the Justice Party, you know, talking to numerous other groups like Vermont Progressive Party, hope that they'll join us as well, you know. And then the objective is to say, like you pointed out, that we have 95% of what we want, you know, is the same. Okay, we can all agree on those 3 points. We need a party that represents working people, you know, and that means you need a progressive party, you know, to represent progressive issues. and it has to be free of corporate money, and none of us can do it alone.
Mhm.
And so let's come together. Let's agree on that fundamental premise first, and then let's go on to discussing things later. In a founding convention, let's have our membership decide things like the platform. Let's have our membership decide things like the exact bylaws, the party name, the color, the mascot, whatever. Like all these decisions, put them up for the people. But first, our approach is let's come together around that which we can agree on. And then we can have the discussions and hash out the things where we might have minor differences. Because like you pointed out also, one of our strengths as the left is that we're very independent. We're very independently minded, and there's a lot of diversity, both in background and in thought. But it makes it difficult when you are trying to come together as the left. Yeah. But it is an inevitable task. And when you look abroad, that's exactly how it has been done before. The last thing I'll say on that question is that in Spain, in Greece, in France, in Chile, recently, exactly. There's in each of those countries, and in others, like in Iceland, there are new parties that have come about just in the past few years, and they have broken those countries' long-standing, decades-long-standing two-party systems. And so something is happening. It's not just in the U.S., but there is this global convulsion, against neoliberalism. And it's new democratic socialist parties in each of those instances, And so that, I think, it is great kind of proof of concept of exactly what we're doing here. And our electoral system makes it more challenging, obviously, but it shows that is really what people are looking for. Stats
have those parties been receptive? A lot of people always bring up the Greens, like inevitably any conversation. And then look, I voted for Jill Stein. I proudly voted for Jill Stein. I didn't see anybody else on the ballot that represented my interests. Jill Stein was the closest to it. So I don't have anything against the Greens. I often hear people bring up the Greens. It's invariably, it doesn't matter what, any conversation you have about another party. And they tend to have, again, no harm in this, a bit of a chip on their shoulder about this whole idea of them being a real party. Now, the Greens are a real party, fair enough. But it boils down to, are you able to get elected? And it always becomes somewhat of a problem with regards to the Greens. Have the Greens themselves been somewhat, because is there a national organization for the Greens? Like, is there a national Green Party type thing that organizes all of the other Greens? Or is there just individual disparate Green parties all throughout the United States?
Yes, there is a national Green Party. It's Green Party of the United States, and they have a national committee similar to the Democrats and Republicans, and they also have a steering committee that kind of manages the day-to-day.
Have they been receptive to something like this?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, and that's very encouraging. Is that I think, and this wasn't true a year ago, I would say, but there is a receptiveness generally across the movement now, that the stage that we're in right now is one of coalition building and combining our forces, because there's no way we can break through otherwise.
Let me be more specific, because to be fair, the saying receptive is it's too slippery. Are they on board for this? Are they, meaning if you contact them and you say, look, we're going to have a convention on November or let's say January the 5th. And we're going to be at this particular square hall, and we would like you to come because we want to have a convention in regards to coming up with a constitution for us, this kind of political structure under the current political structure. Will the National Greens show up for this?
I think they will, but it remains to be seen, and they're going to have to speak. And it's up to them to speak to that affirmatively when they have made that decision.
I guess I'm asking, have you talked to them, and
of course.
They been? Okay. Maybe I'm drilling too much. I'm just trying to get this idea of, because look, I love this idea.
They do want to work in a coalition. Yeah.
Because I love the idea. Democratic Socialism of America, Greens, the unions that came out saying they were thinking about a new party. I suspect that part of the reasons the union were talking about a new party is because their management, or the people who are in the upper echelon of the union, was not necessarily. Let me say it this way. I think anytime you start losing your base, you have a problem. And I would imagine that the union realized a lot of those people started voting for Donald Trump, meaning they started breaking away from what was typically a Democratic stranglehold, understanding that Democrats were at best apathetic towards their interests. The leadership may have been for Democrats, but the people themselves were, for the most part, ended up, a lot of them, a large percentage, going for Trump. Now, if you're the union and you realize that your people are now unruly, they've gone against what you yourself have typically pushed because you yourself, for the most part, have been in bag for Democrats. I would imagine that you yourself would probably say, we need to do something different. And in doing something different, floating this idea of potentially a new party. Man, I love this idea because you're talking about the potential of bringing together unions, which is this kind of underpinning of Democrats. You're talking about the Greens. You're talking about the Democratic Socialists of America. All of these parties that have sprung up all throughout the United States that consider themselves this kind of separate and distinct thing coming under one umbrella. That, mind you, when we're not saying that you're leading all of these groups. All of these groups at this point are coming together under this kind of confederation. Each group is making their choice and making votes and everything else for things that they want. They contain their individuality while at the same token working in a larger purpose and with larger objectives. I love this idea. I just hope the other groups are on board for this idea also. That's all.
Yeah. Well,
oh,
on the topic of unions, it is there have been really interesting developments also. At the AFL-CIO's conference this past October, they actually approved a couple of resolutions that called for a break with the lesser of two evils politics. And so
go ahead.
Yeah, and so it's really exciting. There was also a meeting of union delegates, the AFL-CIO, to discuss the creation of a Labor Party again. And so that a number of unions came together in 1996 and created a Labor Party and tried that. And so there was a lot of discussion about that as well. And so I would say that in general, the union scene remains very much inside the Democratic Party. But what you're seeing now is that you're seeing that it is supposed to be, it's starting to step outwards, and that's good. I mean, that's obviously a huge development. And looking at this from the perspective of unions, I mean, unionization was almost at half the country, I believe, in the 1950s. And so, I mean, it's just self-evident what working with the Democratic Party for 60 years has done, is that it has reduced unionization now to something like 6% in the private sector and something like 15%, I believe, in the public sector. So, it's very low. I mean, that's what you get for working with these two parties. So,
I mean, they put them in a quagmire. I mean, and in fact, I'd make the argument that unions, blacks, Hispanics, all of these other groups, all of these groups who workers, labor, have been stuck in this quagmire, this Chinese finger trap of lesser evil politics. Like there's a certain level of blackmail of, you understand that Republicans are going to go after you. We're apathetic, but they're going to go after you. It's almost like grading on a curve. One guy gets a 45, and so that guy gets an A because the guy got a 45. The other guy gets like a 20. There is a different quality when the party is actually functioning on your behalf. It is a beautiful thing when the party is not this lesser evil, but it's actually working on behalf of labor and working on behalf of all these other groups. I give an example. When you're looking at, I was doing a video where I was looking at Corbyn. Corbyn was in Prime Minister Questions. And Corbyn asked just this basic question of, one of my residents or one of the people sent me a letter saying that their father had a heart attack, or the mom had a heart attack, and they had to wait 3 hours to get service. And he was making this point to her, like, why on earth should citizens of the UK be subjected to this? That is basic, bare bones of this thing of, this is the real world implications of the decisions that we make in our society. And as government, the choices that we make should not screw over the citizenry in this way when we don't have to screw over the citizenry, particularly when we're doing it for reasons that are, let's say, unsavory at best, and don't represent the interests of those people. It is a different thing to have somebody who's vocally in your best interests, as opposed to the argument of you have nowhere else to go. Sick of that
Yeah,
argument. I mean, and unions have been hit with that argument constantly. You're going to support us because you have nowhere else to go. I mean, I have a friend of mine who's in a union. He works for the train stations. And I asked him, I was like, why do you guys support Democrats? I mean, what? You've been decimated. I mean, Scott Walker obliterated that union, and Obama ain't say squat about it. You had like Ed Schultz on MSNBC, holding rallies and everything else like that. You had the unions protesting and marching and running in the governor's center. They didn't get help from the main Democratic Party and all this other stuff. They were crushed, not just crushed in Wisconsin, all throughout the United States, because they understood they did not have a political arm to assist them in the things that they were doing. Obama did not in any way pass the Employee Free Choice Act. He had the House, he had the Senate,
exactly.
supermajority in the Senate, and he had the presidency. He could have did it. He told him he was going to do it. He got in that office and he didn't do squat.
Yeah, and it's not the first time that Democrats have controlled all the chambers. During the Bill Clinton administration, they also controlled They controlled the House and Senate, and so
that's NAFTA. And Obama was going to turn around and pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Both of those things were going to decimate. Well, NAFTA did decimate labor. Ironically, the places where Bill Clinton, where the trade deals that Bill Clinton put through, gutted those areas like Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, those areas that were gutted by the NAFTA thing or by the trade deal. She lost those things, even though those were Democratic strongholds. I would imagine the idea of Clinton's name of being associated with it didn't help. Obama, not only did he not pass the Employee Free Trade Act, he was going to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership, lying through his teeth saying this is the most progressive legislation ever. And then when you read it, you're like, this has little to do with trade and everything to do with corporate takeover of the United States. This is their party.
The Democrats have had every chance to help organize labor, and they could have repealed the Taft-Hartley Act, which was the source of right to work across the country. They didn't do it, and so Obama's signature achievement, was to mandate the sale of a financial instrument, insurance. And it's kind of, of course, and that was Republican healthcare plan, and it's very sad that's touted as like an achievement. Insurance, by the way, is an unnecessary middleman. What people need is healthcare. Insurance, in the logic of capitalism, has asserted itself between you and your healthcare, and it has said no. Instead, you're going to have to purchase a financial instrument, which then we can trade, on Wall Street and this kind of thing. Rather than just saying, no, what you need as a human being is you don't need insurance. What the heck is that? You just need care. If something happens to you, you need care, and you need to know that it's there, and that obviously that's what a national health system does, single payer. So, but they don't want to do it. But
they don't get how sick that is. Yeah. Like they tout that as if it's this awesome thing. You're a human being. It's like, do human beings have value or not? Like if you're born in this country, the richest country on the planet, money for spades, money to the degree of pharaohs, Jeff Bezos, that's $100 billion. So that gives you this idea on the wealth that's in this country. You have value. And if you have value, should that value be espoused in the laws itself? Now, the laws are created by us, meaning as human beings, do you want to say that other human beings have value, that we're vulnerable, and we're going to make sure that we ourselves take care of us? And it seems like the Democratic answer to this is somewhat. Insurance is not the same thing as healthcare. And ultimately, you've enshrined this thing of we need to keep insurance companies who are completely unnecessary to this process in this process, purely because we want them to maximize their profits at the expense of everybody else's health. This is an amazing thing. You have like 20, 30 million people still without healthcare. Meaning they passed the universal health care bill. We talked about this for 8 years. And they're still, at the end of all of this talk, at the end of all this pushing, at the end of Republicans trying to repeal it, like 30 million people who did have health care after they passed that health care bill. And they touted that as a success. They allowed drug companies to continue to rape the public in the way it was going. And they touted this as if this was an amazing achievement by a Democratic president to pass a right-wing health care plan. Do you know, I grew up with medical issues. And at a certain point, you're 17, you're coming down with kidney failure, and you're going to the hospital constantly. You have health insurance, but if you have to go to the health insurance, the doctor over and over and over and over and over again, you're getting one copay after the next, after the next, after the next, after the next. Yes, a mom had healthcare, but you're talking about like $20 every other week, or maybe every week. You're talking about lab tests. You're talking about blood work. You're talking about surgeries back to back to back to back to back. And this person, single parent, has to cover this. And having healthcare or having health insurance, you still end up with these massive amount of bills. It's as if they believe that people didn't go bankrupt just because they have healthcare. If you have a massive surgery, how much is that surgery going to cost? And even if your healthcare takes, let's say, 80% of that, if it's a $100,000 surgery, you're talking about a $20,000 bill. You've put middlemen into these processes that don't need to be in this process, purely because from the standpoint of the Democratic Party, it is better for a market to be in this, for somebody to be able to make a buck off of your illness, as opposed to just providing the goddamn healthcare. This is, I say this because I say this is emblematic of the party itself. When people are looking at what Democrats stand for, and Tom Perez is always screaming about his goddamn values, I say this. I say, I don't know what your values are, Tom. I look at what these guys do. And when he had absolute power of the political apparatus, Medicare for all would have been the easiest thing in the world to understand for people. People love Medicare. And if you would have said, okay, Medicare for all, get rid of these insurance companies, and at the end of the day, we're going to have Medicare, which had like a 2% overhead, to just take over that particular process. If you don't want to do universal health care, at least that was too much. That wasn't even on the table. That wasn't even discussed. Not even a public option being discussed. I mean, a public option would have allowed us to keep costs down. Nope, can't do it. The best that we can do is a healthcare plan that didn't even cover everybody. And the healthcare plan is still allow people to be mauled by their insurance companies. This is emblematic, man. And when people talk about third parties, I kind of point to this and say, this is why. Like, that's an ideological choice. At no point does somebody say what's best for the human being and then take a technical perspective of this, saying, how do we supply healthcare to each and every person in this country in the most cost affordable way? That wasn't done. That wasn't done.
I think that I think that's actually something fundamental that's missing in the U.S. is that, we in this political process of, as a society, trying to determine, which policies we should have and whatnot, it's like we have skipped the first step, and that is
technical choice.
Society,
technical questions.
Yeah. And also, what is our goal? What are we trying to accomplish? It's like we haven't established that. And so, corporations, nonprofits, all kinds of organizations have mission statements. What's the American mission statement? I think we need one. We don't have one. What is the purpose of this society? It's like, why does it exist? What are we trying to achieve? How do we measure? Without a goal, without a purpose, you can't measure success. You don't know, you're just in the wilderness. Try starting an organization that doesn't have a mission statement, bring all these people together. Please, you go in all kinds of different directions, and you never accomplish anything. And so that is the first step, really, is that I think we need to have more of a national mission statement. I think that would be very constructive, actually, for a political dialogue. And so, I think if you spoke to someone on the street about what it should be, like what should our national mission statement be? After a little bit of back and forth, you could get to something like, well, the mission statement, or the society should exist to basically for the benefit of the people who live in it.
That's
it's like, sounds
that's
obvious.
The most common thing in the world. Yeah, that sounds the most obvious thing in the world.
Exactly, but like it needs to be said, because right now it doesn't. Right now it's just like it's the same incentive system in a private corporation. The society exists to maximize private profit. And so you have this system where resources go from those who have the fewest, to those who have the most. When if you had a standard that said that society exists to maximize human well-being, to sustainably maximize human well-being, then a lot of progressive policies would become self-evident. And it would become self-evident that a lot of what we're doing right now is not the way to go, to maximize human well-being. So if you had that goal as a society and that mission statement as a country of sustainably maximizing human well-being, while respecting human rights, of course, then, and you paired that up with science as a method for evaluating, these things, because these things are quantifiable. Human health, public health is quantifiable. It's not like some kind of, esoteric mysticism. It's like people need food, they need water, they need shelter, they need healthcare, they need education. And if they don't have those things, their quality of life is diminished. And so once you establish that as the purpose and you say, we're going to ascertain, the difference between policies scientifically, then anytime a policy choice comes in front of you, you measure it by those guidelines and you say, you know what, does this crazy private insurance healthcare system that we have now better serve healthcare, needs and outcomes than say what most of the world has, in a more public system, a more socialized system? And the answer is, of course, no. And you have the data to back that up, and so these aren't like, again, policy is too much, is treated as a question of ideology. It should be treated instead as a question of science. Once we've established the goal, the science and the technical potential should then guide our decisions.
Agreed. Absolutely agree. And that's not how it's done. I mean, it is impossible for somebody to explain to me how Trump here in any way answers any real question outside of just being an ideological football. You know what I mean? And look, we're post-truth. So we're post-reality. Like the stuff that they said, Paul Ryan would get up there and say, this tax cut is going to be awesome for the American public, and we're going to bring back jobs and all this other stuff. It has nothing to do with jobs. It has nothing to do with anything else. It has everything to do with giving his friends a large amount of cash. It needs to be, these are oftentimes the stuff that comes up within government are technical choices, and they're treated purely as ideological choices. And news media and everything else just parrots what's being said as opposed to actually getting down to the data associated with what's taking place. I agree with you, man. Wholeheartedly agree with you. I guess my issue would be, I think it would be hard for government to do that. I think it would be easier for a party to do that. Like if a party said, this is our mission statement, this is the goal that we're trying to implement, in which case the public can gauge what that party is saying based upon the things that the party does. It's not this kind of just esoteric thing at this point. The party said it was going to do this. Did they do this? Did they represent this? Did they try to implement this? Yes or no? And not in this flowery language, in very specific, concrete language explaining what's taking place. I think that is a big difference between how politics is currently done and how we want politics to be. One of my viewers has a question, Justin B. He says, I understand and agree with your long-term goal to win the left coalition in 2020. But what do you propose in 2018? How do we win big this year? I have an answer for that, but what's your answer, Nick?
Yeah, I say that to start off, I say that we should support as many independent candidates as we can and independent politics as much as we can. But another thing that any activist who has been pushing for an independent politics, for like any length of time in the United States will tell you is that the most destructive thing for independent politics and progressive politics is the election cycle. And so every 2 years, there's this kind of like hysteria that grips the progressive movement, and that grips kind of American media, and it is the election cycle. And so every 2 years, people say, oh my God, we've got this election coming up and there's all these very important issues at stake, and these just horrible Republicans on the other side, and the only or the best vehicle right now to try to oppose them is like the Democratic Party, so like, oh, why don't we just run there? Well, guess what that model has produced time after time after time after time? Guess what that has produced long term? It's brought us exactly where we are. And so, what we're saying is that you cannot let the election cycles guide your long-term vision. Your vision cannot be 2 years out. You have to see beyond that. And so you have to be willing to say, we are going to build something that doesn't rise and fall with the election cycle. We're going to build something that is a permanent institution. So think of all these campaigns that are being run inside the Democratic Party, these progressive campaigns. I mean, the large majority of them are probably going to lose, And so and think of Bernie's campaign, for example. Think of all the resources that are poured into these campaigns, like Bernie's campaign, and think of what would happen instead, of dissolving that, which is what we do. It's like the left pours tremendous resources every 2 years into what amount to pop-up organizations, campaigns, yeah. And then it dissolves. And it's like, wow, it's all gone now. And so instead of doing that, we have to build things that are long-term institutions. So like Bernie's campaign, for example, we've made the argument that Bernie's campaign is effectively, and that coalition that came together there is effectively kind of like the making of a third party in the United States, of an independent party. And so imagine if instead of disbanding it, if he had formalized it, so that like we're actually building on our progress and achievements rather than saying like, all right, that was fun, everybody. 13 million people, go home now, go away. It's like, let's put that together and let's build more and more on it, and let's bring people who like the rest of the country on board who agrees with these issues. So, I mean, that's what I would say is that, in 2018, of course, I would say just don't lose focus of the long-term goal, because it's that inability to step aside, take a deep breath and analyze the situation and plan for a long-term victory, and a long-term, I mean, we're talking about 2020. It's not so far away. It's 3 years,
It's 3 years.
Exactly. So that's necessary so that we don't kind of like just pour all our resources into more kind of pop-up organizations that are going to vaporize come November,
I agree. I agree. I see some of the races and I think to myself, what are the chances of those people going to win? At the same token, I agree with you though. I don't know any organization that pops up in a year or two and just takes and wins in that way. Like you may have candidates who run, but I'm talking about a real organization that has a foothold. One of the arguments, I think it was the Left Forum, where I sat in a meeting and listened to Green Party candidates or Green people who are part of the Green Party have this hour-long debate on whether or not they were going to take dues. And I sit there like, is this the conversation we're having? Like, what are we talking about? No, I laugh at that because it's like, I feel like that should be something that you guys already understand. And that should not necessarily be something when you have a meeting about. That's purely an internal process. Why am I sitting here listening to this conversation? It gets across something where it's like, it's not put together in a way. And I remember the guy showing like angry, like pissed off that he didn't have a meeting space and saying, we don't have enough money to go into the, to have our own meetings and stuff like that. He was angry. And I think part of his being angry is this thing of whether or not you're a real party. I think it chafes them a little bit. They are a real party. They're all over the world in the sense of the Greens, but they have a hard time here. I strongly suspect that the Greens is better off folding itself and working within a collaborative environment, just like I think the other parties would be great doing that. I love this idea of coming together as this kind of collection of representing progressive values and then letting each of these groups speak their piece, like meaning having this kind of like a convergence thing. But instead of convergence, having these meetings, you're talking about having these debates and conversation on what we are. What are we trying to do? How do we do it? These type of conversations and meetings. I love this idea, man. I love this idea.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I would like another thing that I would say is, imagine if the Republican Party in 1854 and all of the activists who were building the Republican Party and the coalition that came together to build it, that was the first year that it came about. It was a few thousand kind of progressives and modernizers and abolitionists and former Whigs who came together in Jackson, Mississippi. I think, I think so. No, it was Michigan. Sorry. And they basically were the ones who started off the Republican Party, which eventually replaced the Whig Party. So imagine if come 1856, the first election, you know, after they founded the party, they had all said, "Oh my goodness, the Whig Party is kind of like the only one, you know, that exists right now. Let's all abandon this project and let's go like get right back into the Whig Party." You know?
Let's try to pressure them once we're in. Once we elect them, we're trying to pressure them to not be for slavery. Yeah,
we would have been. If they had thought that way, we would have been robbed of the abolitionist party that in the end led to, you know, the end of slavery in the United States. And so it's the same dynamic here, you know, and like and I mean that leads to another, you know, great point, which is that when you look at our history, and this is something that, you know, I tell people who still support reforming the Democratic Party. And so when you look at our own history, yeah, they still exist, tomorrow. I know. I don't understand them either. I know. Yeah. But something that I think is really, you know, is really enlightening is that in our own history, third parties, progressive third parties, independent parties have always led the way in achieving kind of the cornerstones of what we consider an advanced society today, you know, and a liberal society today, you know, basically. And so abolition, one example we talked about, but that's just the beginning. It's women's suffrage, child labor laws, Social Security, the direct election of senators, the New Deal, all of these things. There was a third party that was menacing an establishment party, you know, with that issue and threatening them. Basically, if you don't pick that issue up, you know, you're going to see us grow and probably replace you. Yeah. Like happened in the 1850s, you know? And so that has been the only way, you know, that an establishment party has even changed before. And so really, you know, perhaps ironically, if you still want to reform the Democratic Party, the best way to do that is
outside the Democratic Party.
You have an outside pressure. Exactly. Because that's the only way that it's happened before, you know? And so we need to stick to that. Yeah.
I keep saying it's like I've listened to their arguments on this idea of we're just going to push, we're going to pressure, we're going to move, we're going to change them and all this other stuff. And I kept thinking, I was like, but why would they change? Like, well, what do you have in your quiver that gets them to change? From what I understand, the argument is always the same. We're least worst, Republicans are horrible, you should vote for us. But what do you tangibly have to push them to make them do something different? If in 2020, let's say 2018, let's say there's a wave election. And I believe there probably will be some kind of wave election. I think Republicans are gross. I think they're going to freak people out. But let's say in 2018 and 2018, there's a wave election. Democrats take the House, Democrats take the Senate. This takes place. What impetus do they have to change? Like the only thing that it would show is we don't have to change squat. The public will come running back to us because they're terrified of the other guys. Our gimmick holds true. Meaning this gimmick that we have of being least worst Republicans, but scaring the shit out of people, and those people come running back to us when they see how terrifying Republicans are, and then they're running back to Republicans when they see how feckless we are, and then they're running back to us when they see how terrified Republicans are. We can do this forever. We can do this forever. Like, so what has to fundamentally change at that point? It's like they have no power in this. The only power that they have, as far as I can see, is a capacity to make Democrats lose. And if you're not willing to allow them to lose, then nothing changes. Like the stick. The reason why FDR did that stuff, FDR might have been a good guy ultimately, but FDR had people on his heels. He had leftist, socialist, unionists, people who he believed was going to overturn the capitalistic system if he didn't make reforms and change. The reform in this case was to hit the people in the knees who wanted more than reforms, who wanted something that was beyond the reforms. You know, FDR saying he saved capitalism was his thing. Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, coming in trust buster. Part of the reason he was doing what he was doing, he wanted to make sure that the people knew that the government was the main force of this and everybody was subordinate to it. So he was going after some of the crooks or the capitalists. But the other thing was, people are going to revolt. If you keep doing this, you allow people, you know, this much corruption being ensconced in your government, those people at some point are going to corrupt. Are going to change the system. The system is going to be overturned if you keep doing what you're doing. These guys had a healthy fear of something else that is not present in our current day society, meaning Democrats, for the most part, don't feel like there's anything pushing them to do anything different. They've lost 1,100 seats. That's embarrassing. And the only reason they're having this unity commission right now is because they are aware that they lost 1,100 seats. They're aware of what took place in the primaries. But if they just get elected again, where's the impetus?
Exactly. It's going to vindicate everything that they think. Oh, we don't need to change anything. Look, we just need to, hammer away at Trump and how horrible he is. And that's what they've been doing for decades prior. And so, right, it will vindicate that neoliberalism is the model and we have no reason to change. And, part of how I think people need to see this is, you can think of this as kind of a chart, a decision chart, a very simple one. And so the Democratic Party faces a couple of choices, embrace progressive issues or not embrace progressive issues. Okay, so if it does embrace them, it's going to lose Wall Street's money.
Yes.
And all the people inside the party are going to lose their kind of, severance packages that they've been working on for a long time, to build up inside of Wall Street. They're revolving door jobs, they're very cushy retirement packages.
And lobbyist jobs, yeah.
And so, okay, so they'll get progressive votes, but they're going to lose that money. That money go to the Republicans, and they're going to lose their own personal benefits. All right. So, you won something, but you lost something in that. Okay, well, now let's see what happens if they don't embrace progressive issues, in their decision-making matrix. All right, well, they're going to get the money from the billionaires. They're going to get their personal paybacks and kickbacks. And they're also, after some whining and complaining, they're going to get the progressive votes too. What the hell, so like, who wouldn't pick that?
Yeah,
you get both. It's like and so in that model, and that's exactly the kind of decision making basically approach that's leading the Democratic Party, is that right now you pick don't adopt progressive issues and you get everything in the end.
My mom
until you undermine that monopoly that they effectively have over progressives, until they face an existential threat in the way that they did in the past, in the way that that Social Security was passed, in the way that child labor laws were passed, and in the way that the New Deal was passed, until they face that, they see no reason. Logically, they are making the logical choice.
Yeah,
they are making the logical choice by not adopting progressive issues from their perspective, from their personal view. So we need to alter that equation.
Yeah, people keep acting like, there's some kind of integrity in this process. It's not. I was talking to my mom one day, and she was like, well, they got to change now. I mean, they've been losing this much. And it's like, you voted for Hillary Clinton. Like, because I was trying to get across to her, like, you watch my channel. You understand everything that I'm saying. You believe the stuff that I'm saying. I've shown you the articles. I've shown you the history of all this stuff. I've given you a heads up on what's going to take place when Hillary Clinton takes all that stuff. And you still voted for her. It's like, why do you believe that there's going to be change if you, the son or the mom of Progressive Soapbox, still turns around and makes that vote? You are terrified. The argument that they tend to use is this least worst argument. And even though people may hate doing it, even though people may feel like this is status quo, they still end up making that vote, which essentially is complicit in the system being the way it is. That needs to be challenged. And it needs to be challenged in a way of, we're willing to lose. We're willing to let Republicans win if that means that either you will change or something else will spring up to take your place. And until people have that conversation, like, otherwise, nothing changes. I've seen like Donna Brazile and Amika Constant and all these other people, and they're like, well, the party's going to change. It's like, why do you believe that? Like, what on earth makes you think that that's true? I don't, I find this to be just an amazing thing. It's like, they believe that the party is going to change just out the kindness of the party's heart. It's like, why on earth do you believe that? You have nothing in your quiver to make them change. If you're going to say hold them accountable, holding them accountable means allowing them to lose. And up to this point, you've been completely incapable of doing that. So, yes, I mean, I agree with you, man. Until there's something else, meaning the best way to change the Democratic Party is outside the Democratic Party. Like, and they need to know in the same way that we understand breathing, that they're going to lose if they put up candidates that don't essentially abide by certain value systems. And until that happens, meaning until the impetus for this, or until there's a penalty for bad behavior, you're going to continue to get the bad behavior. Let me ask you this. You brought up Sanders.
Yeah.
So this is an interesting point. I made a video maybe 4 months ago. Well, no, it was longer than that. It was almost a year ago. Jesus Christ. Where I kind of made this point that Bernie Sanders is a problem. Now, anybody who watches my channel knows I like Sanders. And I give Sanders all the credit in the world for waking a lot of people up and bringing a lot of people into the process. And I think, based on what you said earlier, saying how you work for all these other establishment candidates and then work with Sanders, it was kind of this, put it this way, it's a different thing when you're working for somebody who you think actually believes what they're saying. Whether Sanders believes what he's saying or not, whether Sanders is playing three-dimensional chess or not, ultimately Sanders is being somewhat of a sheepdog. Now, in being somewhat of a sheepdog to get people into the party itself, this is somewhat of a problem for third. Well, let me ask as a question. Is this a problem for independent politics, meaning for politics outside of the third party? Is Sanders a problem in this case? Is he a hindrance to getting something done on this front?
Well, Bernie actually conveyed to us that, he understood that the Democratic Party might not reform, and so that he was actually happy that alternatives were being built, and so, but on the other hand, of course, it is difficult to build, when you're kind of, when the person who is closest, to the movement's leader, so to speak, at least from the Democratic primary in 2016, when that person is still inside an establishment party,
Yeah.
and is still kind of like remaining there despite the depths to which it sinks. And so that does make it difficult, obviously. But hopefully, hopefully, I think, again, if you're interested in pulling, kind of Sanders out of the Democratic Party, which obviously as Draft Bernie we were, the best thing that's going to do that as well is, again, if you start a new party and you show that there are so many progressives now, and so many Americans who are no longer content to sit inside the Democratic Party, while they do all of this, that really, you have to contend with the fact that we are forming our own party, and that instead, that is something that you should join. I think that's the kind of most, I think that's the biggest call, basically, to action, for someone like Bernie. And hopefully he would accept something like that. But at the end of the day, Jamarl, the American people have already spoken. They've like two to one. They are saying, no, we don't have confidence in the establishment parties. We want a new party, And so that's the foundation of basically what we're saying is that you shouldn't, instead of struggling against the progressive current, like there's this amazing progressive and this independent current, basically. And rather than as progressives trying to fight it, we should go with it. We should embrace it. Don't try to fight it and kind of like plug the leaks in the Titanic, and prevent that from sinking. Rather than in order to try to salvage, this corporate party, which is incredibly entrenched and whose brand is destroyed, and who working people support even less than the Republican Party. So rather than doing that, swimming against the progressive populist current, which we should be very happy that the current, inside society is progressive populist, swim with it, embrace it, create a new party, do what people are asking you to do. It's like, I think that a lot of people in the progressive movement kind of overcomplicate this. And whereas when we're assessing, gee, how is it that we're going to inspire people to turn out? How is it that we're going to inspire people to, come out and really galvanize them to get involved in politics, to be in the streets, to go vote? Well, maybe we should do what they're asking us to do. Like it's not rocket science. Like they're telling us what they want us to do.
How can people get involved in order to help with this? And what would be the best way for them to help? For example, I guess my feeling is one of the ways people can contribute I guess right now you're in outreach. And so the goal is to reach as many people as possible to try to get those people under the umbrella of an organization. And I say umbrella, but I mean, but umbrella, I just mean whatever's created by all of the groups come together. I don't want to necessarily give it a moniker because I don't want people to feel like they're dissolving who they are into something. But how can people help? How can people contribute? How can people lend their time in order to be outreach coordinators for the group itself, to try to pull in all these other organizations? Or is that even what the group needs? What is it that the group needs right now in order to grow and prosper?
Yeah, well, thanks for asking. What we're doing now, our biggest mission is that coalition building. And so, we're talking to tons of DSA chapters and Our Revolution chapters across the country, where there's a lot of support there. And so the biggest thing that I think people can do is join us as state or regional organizers. And we have state and regional organizers in 44 states across the country. Join us as one of them and help us with outreach to progressive groups in your area. Of course, there's lots of other things that people do, as a fully fledged, organization. I mean, we have all kinds of demands, from things like graphic design to web design to social media, so if you want to do any of those things, if you're a good writer, if you're good at fundraising, any of these things that you want to contribute, I mean, we have a volunteer sign-up form on our website, forpeoplesparty.org. And there you can check exactly what it is you would like to do, or exactly what it is that your strength is. And we'll get in touch with you. So,
okay.
Yeah.
I was looking at one of the questions of the person, what people were asking. I've said it before, man. I love this. I like this idea of the left having something to dump their energies into. And I got to be honest, I don't think it's. I think we've moved so far to the right because we've been so complacent that now we're at this point of worse and horrific in regards to our standings. Like, if you look into the UK, the Conservative Party is, for all intents and purposes, the Democratic Party, meaning the right-wing party in the UK is the Democratic Party, supposed to be the left in this country. That's embarrassing. Like that's horrific. And no, like it's hard to get Americans to understand this. Americans have been socialized into an idea of what they believe the world is. And they believe that, well, this is the system that we're interacting with. This is the system I grew up in. This system has allocated funds in a way that somebody has $100 million and somebody else is being kicked out of the hospital because they can't afford their hospital bill. It is hard to get across to them that the world does not have to look this way, that the allocation of resources in the way that we've allocated them doesn't have to look this way. And certainly it's not, for all intents and purposes, it's not fair. So I love this idea of having something else that tries to articulate that particular vision in a more direct way, as opposed to get some random guy in and just pressure him, push him. It's like, come on, why do I have to pressure somebody who's supposed to be representing my interests, at the very least in the words that the person is saying? So I love this. I absolutely love this. So do you have any candidates currently that are on the marquee that you want to, I guess, kind of give a heads up to that's out there?
Well, we are supporting Gail McLaughlin in California, and she's running as a no party preference independent. She was a two-term mayor in Richmond, California, and the co-founder of the Richmond Progressive Alliance.
Whoa, okay. I remember. I know that group. Okay.
Yeah, and so she's she's just a fabulous candidate, a great example of what independence can achieve. And she took basically what was a town that was owned by Chevron, an oil town, a company town, and through this coalition of progressive groups in the Richmond Progressive Alliance, they managed to wrestle that town against $3.5 million of corporate advertising against them and win a supermajority on city council, and for her to be elected twice for mayor. And I mean, they did all kinds of things like that. I mean, they reduced the homicide rate by like 75%. They
Wow.
provided, they lowered the cost of energy and made it cleaner. I mean, they introduced the first rent control law in California in 30 years. And so they just vastly improved, that community. And it showed that it can be done again. you know. And so she's a candidate that we're endorsing now, and she's fabulous. A great example of, you know, what independent politics can be, really.
Are you guys coming up with another, I guess I want to say convergence, but it wouldn't be convergence, but some date or something else where all of these groups and all of these people are coming together? And if so, what's the criteria? Like, what's the thing that would allow a person to be a delegate in something like that?
Well,
Or for
that
that
should
matter,
be
have you even thought about that? Like up to that point?
yeah.
Um,
It should be the founding convention. It should be the
yeah.
founding convention of the new party, whatever people would like to call it. You know, we like using People's Party as a description because that's what it should be. It should represent the people. You know, it should belong to them. And so at that point, you know, the idea is once this coalition, you know, has decided and made that announcement that it is creating, you know, a new party, then at the founding convention, delegates, members of the new party will be able to come together. They'll be able to participate either in person, physically at the convention, or online in order to design the platform and to pick the party processes and bylaws, you know, and then all those other details about the party that I mentioned before, like the name and the
Okay.
color. So, you know, that is what should be next. I think that's the stage we're in. And, you know, it was done 2 years after that disastrous election in 1852. And here we are 2 years from the 2016 election, likewise, similarly poised. And so I think that we can follow their footsteps. Absolutely.
Is it anything you want to say that I haven't asked, or is there anything you want to communicate to the audience, or just in general? I'll say speak your piece that I haven't necessarily said, or.
Well, we talked a little bit before the program about how an entirely different society is possible. And I think that even most progressives haven't fully internalized that and understood kind of exactly, you know, what I mean, at least when I say that. And so when I say that, is, you know, I mean that I look at the difference between our society's potential, where we could be in terms of, again, the criteria of maximizing human well-being sustainably. And so I look, okay, what is that potential? The potential is something distinct from our actual level, you know, of kind of existence and the actual level at which we're satisfying human needs. And the difference between that potential and where we actually are has never been greater in human history.
Yeah.
You know, today, the potential that we have to exist in something that resembles Star Trek, you know, or something in which all of people's basic needs are completely met, you know, these are things, it has never been greater before in human history, you know. And I think of that, the difference between those two things, our potential and where we are, as a measure of political failure, you know?
Yes.
And so the political failure accounts for that difference. And so basically, you know, these are things that FDR proposed 80 years ago. When he ran in 1932, he also talked about it in the State of the Union in 1944. He ran on an economic bill of rights, you know, and it was provide food, water, clothing, you know, housing, basic, it was recreation even, you know, freedom, a good job, freedom from monopolies. And so that was possible 80 years ago.
Yeah.
And the determinants of what's possible is very different from the determinant of what exists. What our potential level of development is determined by the resources that we have, the technology that we have, and our knowledge to basically combine those things.
Yeah.
And those are the real determinants of where we are as a society. You know, politics has nothing to do with it. It's really a calculation of those resources and our potential to use them, you know, our technology. And so I think until you understand things like that current estimates are that, you know, we could end extreme poverty for 140 billion a year. Well, that's less than a quarter of the military budget of one country on this planet, you know, of the United States. And we could still have the biggest military budget in the whole world. Or that, you know, we could provide potable water for everyone, you know, across the world for like $30 billion. Or that we could, you know, we could produce all of our food in through vertical agriculture,
Yeah.
which so that we can farm indoors. Basically, you can produce the food at the same place where the population centers are in cities. So then it eliminates, and it's soilless, you know. So you eliminate pesticides, you eliminate fertilizers, and you eliminate all of the fossil fuels and everything that goes into the transportation of that. Not to mention, you free up the 11% of the Earth's surface, which is taken up, land surface, which is taken up by right now agriculture. You know,
Yeah.
we could have limitless, free, clean energy, basically, nearly free. You know, or that could totally replace fossil fuels in terms of rooftop solar, in terms of geothermal, in terms of wind, and we could move away from a centralized grid into a distributed form of energy production. We could move away from fossil fuels in automobiles and in all vehicles over to electric vehicles. You know, it's like that's what's technically possible. There's nothing, there's no law of nature, and there's no like divine edict which is holding us back from those things. It's just the way that we've set up our society and that we've set up our economy. You know,
it's insane.
And I think
it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I think that if we don't do those things, I think something that very much motivates me is the concept of existential risk, and that's the idea that we as human beings now have the ability to wipe ourselves out, basically, with our own technology. And we achieved that about 70 years ago with nuclear weapons. And
well, even backwards, like what you're saying is even a backwards way of killing ourselves off. Like everything, like it's amazing. Like talking about that are befalling us just based on our normal way of operation. Like we consider it just as normal and natural as can be, and we're killing ourselves just by being as normal as natural can be. So we have animal habitation where we're killing these animals in order for hamburgers. And this is messed up in two ways. You've taken a human being and you've had that human being with all the potential in the world dropping French fries. That particular human being who's dropping French fries is also flipping hamburgers. That hamburger came from a cow that was on some farm somewhere where they were using the land and destroying the land. Now, the animal agriculture has just as much problematic as fossil fuels, meaning in regards to climate change. It has a 50%, it's like 50% of the things that they're saying cause climate change comes from animal habitation, meaning the way we do our animals, animal agriculture. So the person who's eating that hamburger is somehow contributing to his own demise of the planet, in addition to contributing to the guy who's flipping hamburgers, who's subordinating themselves with a little stupid looking hat and a shirt on, flipping French fries, all the potential of this particular human being being turned into a drone. This is messed up on several ways, including this particular guy getting a low wage job while the money is funneling to the top. This entire process is a capitalist process. This person is doing a job because that person needs a job, not because they love it, meaning this aspect of that person that's required for that person to be self-actualized, for that person to feel like is completely subjugated and subordinated and giving a low wage. The company itself is putting massive amounts of cash in the hands of a very few people, so the company itself is making a huge amounts of cash. The cows that they're using, for the most part, are being brutalized and tortured in these pens, while at the same token destroying the planet in the process. Now, this is considered just normal. And yet, this is something that's destroying the planet. The person who drove his car to work or drove his car to get that hamburger, again, contributing to the demise of the planet using the fossil fuels in order to do it. This is just our normal everyday life. The plastic that the thing was wrapped in is now in our oceans. What, by 2030, more plastic in our oceans than fish. Our sperm count in the West down by 40-50%. 40% of the extinctions that have taken place over the last 40 years. This is our behavior. Like, this is not, like, this is what we as human beings consider normal, natural behavior. The fact is, there is no such thing as normal, natural behavior. Human beings are naturalized and socialized based upon the conditions to which they're raised in. In this case, we've natural and normalized ourselves based around something that's not real, cash. While at the same token, the planet itself that we're living on is being destroyed by the pursuit of that unreal thing. You're right. It's amazing. Like, yeah, I guess my point is, it's not just being able to destroy ourselves with nuclear weapons. We're also destroying ourselves based on the behaviors that we've taken around the globe.
I totally agree. I totally and I think there was a, when we crossed that line when we developed nuclear weapons, though, it became materially distinct because any intolerant tyrant, or warlord in the past could they're no matter how militant they may have been and how ruthless they may have been, there was no single individual or no single country that could literally end the existence of a human species,
Yeah.
and that's no longer true. It began with one country, the United States, development of atomic weapons, and now it has proliferated to about it's 9 countries, and then there's about 16 more paranuclear countries, which have the ability to produce a nuclear bomb very quickly. And the atom bomb has become a lot more powerful itself.
Oh, yes.
It's become the hydrogen bomb is thousands of times more powerful than the ones that were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Yeah.
And so that there's 2 different trends that existentially threatening technology of nuclear weapons entered once it was developed, once it was invented. It entered one trend, which was it became more destructive with time, exponentially. It entered another trend, which is it proliferated over time, exponentially. And so now and so the risk increases as you do that, basically, from the technological perspective. The weapon's in more hands and it's more dangerous, more destructive. But now what we're talking about doing, in the next few years of technologies that are in development right now, is you're talking about developing things which make nuclear weapons look like toys almost. You're talking about nano weapons. You're talking about biological weapons. You're talking about artificial intelligence. And so those things are themselves existentially threatening technologies because nuclear weapons were the first, but they weren't the last. And so each time you develop one of these new ones, like bioweapons, like nanotech, it enters the same 2 trajectories that nuclear weapons did. That is, it proliferates and it becomes more powerful.
Man.
And so you get this scenario on the aggregate where there are many more existentially threatening technologies, all of them becoming more powerful, all of them spreading into more hands. And it's a situation that has explosive potential, basically, for the human species. Yes. And I think that, and very, very dire consequences. And I think that unless we manage that correctly, it could be that intelligent civilizations wipe themselves out at a very high rate in the universe, for specifically reasons like this. And I think that the role that politics plays, and the reason that, that one of the reasons that I myself am in politics is because politics acts as a multiplier for all of that. So when you have a society which is premised on conflict and artificial scarcity and deprivation, then the risk of that, of some kind of catastrophe, is magnified exponentially as well. And so I think that, it provides a kind of even additional, incentive that is existential at this point to really change the way that we operate. It's, it's our survival, both on kind of an individual level and on a humane level and on a moral and spiritual level, I think, that is at stake here. But it's now the stakes are even, it's their survival outright, as a species. And that increases with time. But the other side of that coin is what we talked about before. That is, technology is just a tool, and the same way that it can destroy us and it could annihilate us, we could annihilate ourselves with it. It could create a world which is, kind of beyond our imagination in terms of allowing us to self-actualize, meeting our needs.
Yeah, people get so normalized into the way the world is, so they have a hard time seeing what it could be. And even in a weird way, believing that society is organized in a natural way. Like the way we're organized is the natural way to organize. Like,
right.
this is why I did it. And you're trying to make this point like, no, these were policy choices that people did to advantage themselves while disadvantaging others. And those policy choices can be changed. All this stuff can be changed. We don't have to be organized this way. I was talking to one of the politicians in, I think it was a People's Summit. And as we were talking, I said, look, why aren't houses independent energy generators? Like, we have technology at this point where that house can be energy independent. It doesn't have to be connected to a grid. Whether you're talking about solar power or wind power, those things can be in the house itself. So anytime a house is built, those things are built in a way that makes itself energy independent. If it needs additional energy for the grid, fair enough. But solar panels are getting better and solar power is getting better and that stuff is getting better, meaning that house can most likely be energy independent. We, as any party or any politics, should strive for that. If we have a problem in regards to energy, meaning how we're producing energy is destroying our climate, then it seems as natural can be to acknowledge that from a scientific standpoint of saying we need to do something different because what we're doing is destroying ourselves. One of these ways is, hey, let's make these houses energy independent. A, the person is not paying a bill anymore for energy because that house is essentially generating its own energy. And B, that person is a little bit more freer than what that person was before. And you expand that particular idea out to your society as a whole. How can we make people free? Now, libertarians have this cartoonish idea of freedom, like, as if you could be free and fuck everybody else, and I got mine, so I got my, as opposed to this idea of you're going to be free when everybody else is free. And their understanding of free is off. It's this idea of when you get up in the morning, you're doing what you want to do, not because you have to do it. Yes, there are going to be things you do where you work, but what work is may be something different and fundamentally different what we consider work to be now. And ultimately, if we're being honest, many of these jobs can be automated. And any job that can be automated should be automated. I don't want a human being flipping French fries. If we have the capacity for a car to go from point A to point B, I want the car to go from point A to point B. I don't want a taxi in that car. The problem becomes us. Like in this case, how we perceive it, the problem become us. You go to CVS, they have all these little plastic toys that nobody buys, and yet there's a bomb sitting out on the street. There was money that went into making those plastic toys. There was money went into making all this stuff that nobody's going to buy, and yet there's no money to make sure this guy's okay. The problem becomes us. We can change this. Like, I give you an example. Like energy. Using like piezoelectric meters on the ground itself. So when a person walks, it captures the energy of that particular person and use it for certain things in the society. Our technology is phenomenal in regards to what we could do with this technology. And we use it purely for the sake of profit at the expense of everybody else. It is an amazing thing that we allow our society to do this. Not to mention, when you add that, like you said, an existential threat of what we're doing is destroying ourselves. You have scientists with their hair on fire saying, look at what you're doing to the world. Look at what you're doing to the environment. The climate is collapsing. Your habitat is collapsing. Nothing changes. We have the technology. Nothing changes. All of this stuff becomes a choice. I guess the question becomes, how do you get people to realize that the way that they're living is fundamentally a choice and that this choice can be different?
Yeah.
And it's like, that is the hardest thing in the world to do.
I think that it's essential. People have to understand how we could live. That's essential, because only when people understand how we could live do people really comprehend the magnitude of that theft, of what this system is. I also think that I think that the 20th century was defined by economies of scale and by consolidation. And it was defined by the fact that, you had the Industrial Revolution, and it was cheaper to produce on the margins for each unit of good produced. It was cheaper to produce if you were consolidated, basically. I think the 21st century, thanks to a lot of the technologies that we've developed, like 3D printing, distributed energy production, rooftop solar, all of these different things. For that reason, I think the 21st century has the potential to be the century of distributed production and decentralization. Distributed energy production, manufacturing could mostly be done on an individual level in the way that 3D printing is advancing. You could produce all of your silverware, your clothes, basically,
Yeah.
You could produce all kinds of things like that at home instead of going to, and that fundamentally changes kind of the retail model that we have. If you have one device that can basically produce every appliance and household item,
Yeah.
and so that is the potential kind of on one side for a totally distributed system of operation. And the same thing could happen on the political level, where you could have potentially with blockchain voting in the future, you have much more direct democracy. You have forms where people are voting online on more policy directions, in addition to government representatives. So that is the potential, that decentralization and that distributed kind of model for the 21st century. If we manage to kind of intelligently manage and utilize the application of that technology, as opposed to letting it, kind of go haywire in this conflict-driven system.
You got to get people over the hurdle. I mean, honestly, it's like people are an aggregation of all their experiences and things that they encounter. Meaning, like, if somebody grew up in a Japanese society in samurai times, they're going to behave that particular way. There may be a range of their personality, meaning an aspect of them that's them, but that's only really accepting or rejecting the elements in that particular society, making that person who that person is.
Yeah,
people only know what's being invested in them and making small permutations against the thing that they're associated with. Part of the hardest part is getting people to realize that your society doesn't have to be this way. Like, maybe not necessarily Star Trek. We might not necessarily have these auto generators right now. But when you're talking about how things should be arranged, the moment that you accept that we live on a ball hurling through the cosmos, and that planet is a living planet that we ourselves completely rely upon for our life force. If anything happens to that planet, it's also going to happen to us. The planet will be here, we may not. And it is irrational, as irrational could be, to take on any system, be it capitalism or anything else, that is destroying your planet. Like, the moment that you say there's something higher than a human being and there's something more important than a human being, you've essentially raised something that's unreal, beyond your own level. Like, that's an amazing fucking thing, that this ideology that we take on. You're right. Like, you think of, there should be no poverty, there should be no hunger. You have a situation where people have so much junk and so much stuff that they need advertising. They put billions and billions of dollars in advertising to get you to buy more stuff. So it's like we've saturated you with stuff to the normal level that you as a human being would accept. So now we've taken on psychology in order to get you to buy stuff that you don't need a profit. Then you have this odd Ponzi scheme that completely ignores the fact that you have a finite planet. So on this finite planet, they've come up with a Ponzi scheme that would allow them to get stuff, harvest stuff from the planet, put that stuff into devices that you give people, and those devices falling apart, meaning they need to harvest more stuff from the planet to put in more devices that you buy that eventually gets thrown away. They do this because now you have this Ponzi scheme where, well, we need to continue to make more of this. If this lasts for 10 years, then you're not going to buy one for 10 years. And all of these people are going to lose their jobs. You want people to lose their jobs? It's like, no, but I also don't want people to having to pull stuff out the ground, like minerals and like, let's say you make a computer and then you throw that computer away in 2 years, right, just because that company wants to continue to make computers and want to employ people who make those computers. And you're like, but wait a minute, you have a finite planet. You're talking about throwing away resources, model going, even though you have a finite planet. It doesn't make sense. Like, I'm just saying that the model itself doesn't make sense. You have people working in cases where they don't really need to work, purely just for the sake of work, just to put money in other people's pocket. You could have a computer that, let's say, lasts for 10 years, and you go in and you change the inner workings of that particular computer without throwing the entirety of the computer away, with the other stuff inside of it being recycled. In this case, you're not just pulling stuff from the ground just for the sake of pulling stuff from the ground. You're not keeping somebody on a job that doesn't necessarily need to be on the job. You're living in a society that's meeting the needs of the people in a society without necessarily forcing people to do inane work that they don't necessarily need to do. Like, it's almost like you're working just for the sake of work just so you can work. Like it's not an overarching reason to it. It's not we're working in order to make sure people have the supplies that they need, which should really be the point of any kind of work in a society. It's you're just working just to work. And it's bizarre. It's pretending as if the planet is not finite. It's pretending like you've come up with this situation where you have like all of the poverty, and the poverty is completely unnecessary. Or you have people who don't have things that they need, even though you have factories churning out like 1,000 t-shirts in a minute. Like it doesn't make sense. The goods and the supplies don't necessarily get to the people who need them. It gets to the people who can afford them. And that is a bizarre society to have. And we agree to it
Gabor Mate
implicitly.
has a great example where he says, you know, if there's a billionaire somewhere who wants a golden toilet seat and he has the money to pay for it, you know, but then there's kind of like a starving family somewhere else, you know, and they need they need food and medical care. Where are society's resources going to go?
Yeah.
You know,
that's amazing. That's
amazing. You know, and so you replicate that, you multiply that times a billion, and you get our society.
I mean,
there is absolutely no connection between human needs and the distribution of resources, and that's insane. It's insane.
6 people has half of the world's wealth, or has more wealth than the half of the world, or something.
Yeah, I think it's like 5 people now.
Yeah, that's insane. Like there's. Or you even end up in this other thing where I think the stats said like 60% of the world's population makes like under $10 a day, where you have like a good 25% that only has 2. Like this is a problem. Like I understand people are raised in a particular system, but what those people need to realize is no one was here to give anybody anything. Like there's no situation where somebody said, here, I'm giving you all of this land, meaning the first guy, the first man, the first person to realize that I'm a human being. Nobody gave him anything. The resources on this planet, fundamentally, just from a philosophical standpoint, belongs to all of the people on this particular planet. Anything that was taken was stolen or essentially killed in order to get with governments and everything instantiating their authority once those things were settled, meaning we've taken this, we've stolen this, and now we have a government here that's going to enshrine our particular advantage into law. You fast forward X number of hundreds of years, and it's like, well, this is normal. That's not normal. Those resources were taken and stolen, and they instituted a process that would allow them to instantiate their gains or hold on to their gains. You, being a human being, growing up in a particular system, has a value system based on what's fair, based on the system itself. Meaning the system that was enshrined to keep things a particular way, your value system is based purely on that. So your judgment on this, it's like you look at what's his name with $100 billion, and you're like, well, he got that in this particular system, so I mean, he got it in a fair and honest way. But the larger question is, should your system allow any one human being to have $100 billion in the first place? Particularly if you have anybody in that system who's not having health care. I did a story the other day where this woman got thrown out of a hospital at night. She was wearing a nightgown and slippers because she didn't have the money to pay for her hospital bill. They literally tossed her out at night. The security guards just walked back as if they didn't do anything. This system is the problem. Like, it's hard to get that across. Not only is the system destroying the planet, literally destroying the planet. That's not hyperbole. The system is destroying the planet. It's also destroying us. This level of inequality that's obscene, and anybody in their right mind, if you had some other species that was looking at this from outside of our planet system, they would think we were insane. It was like, what justification did you guys come up with? What con did you guys accept that would allow the resources on that planet, those resources who weren't given to anybody, that was literally for everybody? What game, what con did you accept that would allow one of you to have that much while others have little to nothing? That it is an amazing thing that a system would allow this. And it's even that much more amazing that the 99% looks at this and says, okay, that's fair. That's fair. It should not be allowed. That should not be allowed. And this is to some degree the failure of politics, and to some degree the win of politics. I mean, if you're looking at politics being this thing that allows this particular thing to be enshrined in the way it is and to keep order and to maintain the status quo. If you look at government as being this kind of like Lenin will call it this class antagonism. Like the whole point of government is to maintain the antagonism between the classes of the rich and the poor. If you look at it through that lens, John, it's maintain a certain status quo based on the way things are. I would argue, though, that politics needs to go beyond that. And in some degree, there needs to get something to put a fire in the people to understand, for those people to understand that A, they're being exploited. B, there is no reason that the resources should be distributed in the way that the resources are distributed. And C, that they have value. And not only do they have value, they should look at themselves at a higher level than what they look at themselves. And I'm on a tangent, but if you look at the people in Europe, let's say somebody in Germany, just a regular person in Germany, they're not concerned about healthcare. They're not concerned about college. Of all the things that may assail that person as a human being, there are two things that are not: college and healthcare. At very bare bones, their society says, look, we want, at the very least, that person to be somewhat self-actualized. We, as a society, want to give that person an opportunity to do that. We don't want to put them $50,000 in debt. We don't want to create debt slaves in our society. That does not make a good German citizen. That does not make a good citizen at all. We want you to have a bare bones, basic level of existence in operating in our society. That's how they see themselves. If the German counselor, if Merkel came out and said, you know what, we're going to start putting $50,000 of debt on the kids, and yeah, you're going to stop paying for your healthcare. As a society, we're no longer going to help with that, meaning we're not going to cover ourselves for healthcare. They would have riots in Germany. They would burn that place to the ground because they, at the very least, look at themselves as being worth enough, where as a society, they want to take care of themselves in that way. We as a society don't do that. Like, well, when you have a debate and you have some members in the audience saying, let them die on the street, that is abysmal. That gives us idea of what we see ourselves as human beings as being worth, our value as human beings, as compared to other human beings. It needs to change, man. And if that's done through the political apparatus, fair enough. Do you believe that's something that can be done through politics? Or do you believe that's something that needs to be done outside of the political system?
I think that something can be done through the political system, and I don't think it's a neat boundary between the two either. I think that by starting a People's Party and a coalition of the left and electoral system, you know, within the electoral system that we have, then I think if it is, you know, say it's true that not even it can succeed. Say the electoral system is so controlled, you know, that not it couldn't succeed either in the Democratic Party or in a new party, you know, perhaps that's true. But even if that's true, it will take exhausting all of the options basically until you reach that point, you know. And so it's kind of like, okay, we have exhausted the Democratic Party as a potential vehicle for achieving progressive politics and a sane economy in politics, you know. And so, all right, we are going to try basically starting a new party, you know. And that will, in itself, it will build a social movement, you know, around that, and it will help also serve as an extension to the social movements that exist, giving them an electoral wing, so to speak, and it'll be born from them. But you know, even if say that doesn't succeed, you know, then at that point you would know, I think that, I mean, you would need just some kind of drastic, direct action, you know, to change things, you know, like. For example,
go ahead, say it. We're adults. We can say it. You're adults.
Huh?
Go ahead, say it.
What?
Your drastic action. You're using euphemisms. You're saying at that point you're talking about leaving outside the political apparatus to make change.
Yeah, I'm not talking about violent revolution though.
No. I don't mean
it's
that
less
way.
effective. What I'm talking about is for what was done in the 30s, for example. So what was done in the 30s is you had the bonus army. It was many thousands of soldiers from World War I who hadn't been compensated, hadn't been paid by the government. And in the midst of the Depression, they occupied Washington, D.C. And, you know, and that was very menacing, basically, to the establishment. And that's kind of a similar thing, which I think we should do, you know, if nothing kind of electorally was to work, is I think Occupy Wall Street did a lot of good things. It put inequality on the map, but it could have gone a lot further. And I think the focus was also off. I think it could have institutionalized into a party, kind of like Podemos did from the M14 movement in similar circumstances. and now it's had great success in Spain. But we didn't do that. And that's why we need to build electoral institutions, as independent electoral institutions. But another thing that I think was off is that it targeted Wall Street. Wall Street is private. It's a collection of private institutions. Right now, a court, as the system is structured, and this is obviously also a problem, but we're not supposed to have any influence in those, institutions. Corporations, in political terms, are straight up tyrannies. There's no internal democracy. The orders go straight down. The profits go straight up. And there's no election of leadership. But we do have an institution. Human beings have fought and advanced human rights sufficiently that we have an institution now that is supposed to be theoretically under public control, and that is the government, And so that's what we need to occupy, because that's the institution which is supposed to be running things and which is supposed to be also under our control. So I think an Occupy movement in Washington, D.C., just like the bonus army, is much more effective. And that's what I mean by direct action.
I see. And the irony of that is, and Democrats too, Democrats more so for the weakness, have gotten people to believe that government is a problem. Like, in their mind, it's completely missing this point. Libertarians make this argument too, this insane argument that the problem in this is government. Not completely missing the fact that your influence, the only influence that you have in any of these political bodies or any of these bodies, is government. That private corporation, that private citizen that they prize and all this other stuff, that guy can draw a line on the map, and the police that are paid for with tax dollars will beat you in the head to keep you out of that particular line. Your influence in this is the political apparatus, meaning government. Occupy Wall Street. Yeah, man, it was euphoric and at the same token disappointing. We just want a decentralized structure, man. And it's like, yes, but the goal is to get shit done. The goal is not to have this hippie party and to show your frustration and outrage. It's to get something done. It's to coalesce into something that has this kind of political might and political influence. And the sad part about it is, under a Democratic president, crushed, as opposed to becoming something significant or pushing him forward and all this other stuff. Yeah, it was. I agree, man. I agree. All right, Nick, it's almost been 2 hours. Oh, it has been 2 hours. I give one last comment, just in case you want to say something to the audience or anybody else on this particular topic. I open the floor to you.
Well, thanks for having me on. I invite everybody, come and join us and be a part of founding it this year, founding a People's Party. Come join us in building the coalition. That's what we're doing right now. And come and join us in all of the other different areas, that we need help as well. I think this is kind of, what we're doing here is historic, and we are following the model in which it has been done successfully before, the Republican Party, but also in the way that any kind of progressive landmark milestone achievement has been achieved in our own history of all those other things. So, yeah. So besides that, it's great to talk to you, Jamal.
And what's the website one more time, just so people would know?
It's forapeoplesparty.org.
And I would say, if anyone has connections to some of the other progressive organizations, and if anyone in that progressive organization, or if anyone is in the progressive organization itself that wants to be part of the coalition, I would say contact Nick also.
Oh, absolutely. We'd love to talk to you guys. And you can, there's a form on the website, which is for any particular organization which would like to join us. And you can also reach out to us at organize@forapeoplesparty.org. So yeah,
cool.
We'd love to have.
Nick, I appreciate you coming on, man. I am sorry if I interrupt. I'm bad at that. I try to get better at it. Sometimes there's a space or there's a gap in the way that the communication is. So I think that there's a lag, in which case I start talking about it. Dude, I appreciate you coming on. I think what you're doing is an awesome thing, and I fully support it. So I appreciate your time and everyone else's time for coming on for Nick to have a conversation about this. So I'm going to end it here. Yeah, guys, thank you for coming on, and you guys have a good night.
Wonderful talking to you.
All right.